Fire Emblem is known for having some very powerful skills. Stuff like Vantage and Wrath can easily turn the game on its head, with more passive boosts like Alear's personal skill, Divinely Inspiring, can be strong enough to build your entire strategy around. But for every treasure that is Rend Heaven or Armsthrift, there's trash. Today I'm going to talk about some of the worst skills Fire Emblem has ever introduced. I was initially just going to cover personal skills, but a few general skills from Path of Radiance and Awakening are so bad that I couldn't not include them on the list. For today's video though, we're going to be focusing on the Tellius duology and onwards. There's honestly no skill in FE4 or FE5 that are outright completely useless or actively detrimental to the likes of the skills that are about to be discussed. Path of Radiance. Knife. Starting off the list with perhaps the worst skill ever invented, Knife is a skill that was created as a nerf to sages. What does it do? It gives your promoted sage access to the knife type weapons. Not to be confused with knives in later games, Path of Radiance knives are terrible. There are 3 types of knives in the game. All are one-range weapons with incredibly low might, somewhat low durability, high cost, are not part of the weapon triangle, and cannot be forged. So why would you ever want your sages, units who specialize in magic in the first game since the GBA era to split strength and magic, to use weak physical one-range weapons? You wouldn't. There's no situation in which you would want that, outside of maybe fighting an enemy bishop with maxed resistance. But knives are so weak you probably would fail to one-round them anyway. But that's not even the worst part. The worst part about Knife is that Knife replaces staff access. Yes, if you pick knives on promotion from mage to sage, that sage will never be able to use any staff for the entire game. This is why people call knives a sage nerf in skill form. Both Khalil and Bastion, the game's only pre-promoted sages, have knives instead of staves. Intelligence Systems was so afraid of creating a new pent that they got rid of staves from your pre-promoted sages entirely. Because of all this, Knife has to be the worst skill Fire Emblem has ever had. Corrosion. Barely a step up, and probably the worst proc skill in the series, Corrosion is a skill percent chance when the user hits to reduce the durability of the enemy's equipped weapon by 1/4 of the user's level. Not only does this not affect combat directly, but it's such a low amount of damage that most weapons will take multiple procs before they break, and the enemy will likely be dead before the weapon even does so. The worst part about this though is that in Path of Radiance specifically, if an enemy drops their weapon, you get it with whatever durability is left on it. So while you might be tempted to break the more fragile weapons of some bosses, like Petrine's Flame Lance or Bertram's Rune Sword, to make the fight easier, doing so means missing out on that weapon entirely, and having an unintended proc of Corrosion means you've just wasted a good chunk of your own future uses of that weapon if you got it. Not a good skill, actively detrimental. Corrosion definitely earns its place on this list. Let's move on to Awakening. Underdog. As a plus 15 hit and avoid swing against any unit higher level, it might seem odd that Underdog is on this list, but it's a skill that requires a level 15 villager to learn. This means that you can only get this skill on Donald or his kid, or some spot pass units, and only if you stay in the worst class in the game by far until level 15. As if training Donald to level 10 to be able to change his class wasn't annoying enough, you're now going an extra 5 levels in a class so bad that reclassing into a fighter or mercenary, a tier 1 class, gives several points in almost every stat. All this for a skill that will probably turn itself off as soon as you're promoted, as it counts promoted classes as plus 20 levels over base classes. If you really want to use Donald, don't make your life harder by sandbagging him for 5 extra levels for this worthless filler skill. Now that we're at Fates, it's time to talk about personal skills. These skills are locked to a single unit and can never be turned off. On the bright side, this means they aren't competing for space with your chosen skills. On the other hand, if a personal skill has any detrimental element, it's cursing that unit forever, and there's nothing you can do about it. Misfortunate Arthur. If Gamble's -5 hit was bad by Awakening standards, Arthur's Curse of Misfortune is quite literally a death sentence. Reducing nearby enemies' crit avoid to up to 15% is good, and the way it works, it counts for your other units too. But -5 crit avoid on Arthur is very not good. If you've ever used a unit with 0 luck, you know how scary it can be to see those enemy crit chances constantly, even at just 1 or 3%. What both saves this skill and makes it far worse is that crit avoid can't go negative in Fates. So while Arthur with his super low luck is realistically not taking that much more crit chance, he also won't be providing the full 15% potential very often, meaning you can effectively read this skill as Arthur and enemies nearby Arthur have 0 luck when calculating crit avoid. His own crit avoid can be bolstered by a forged bronze axe, but if you ever want to run Arthur with a dual club or a hammer, there's always that small, itty-bitty chance that he will get slammed by a critical hit. And with a game before the advent of the turn wheel, there's no do-overs for dying to a 3% one. Bottom line, this skill basically says that, sooner or later, Arthur is going to eat a critical hit. You'll only reset for his death so many times before you reconsider resetting, or even deploying him at all. Divine Retribution. Azama. Unpromoted staffers tend to be incredibly vulnerable, both in terms of frailty and not being able to deal damage back. Azama is bulkier than most dedicated healers, and Divine Retribution was the developer's attempt to let him counter a bit. Divine Retribution allows Azama to deal half the damage he takes from adjacent foes back if he is unarmed. Not the most useful personal skill, but at least has an interesting use, and it's like way better as a skill when he's an enemy unit, which feels like what this skill was designed around. This lasts up until he promotes or reclasses, at which point any use this already niche skill had would be lost. There are incredibly few times Divine Retribution would ever be better than countering with an actual weapon, and even in those circumstances, you're probably not going to remember to disarm him because there are just so many better options to deal with your foes than leaving a disarmed healer on the front lines. Fierce Rival. Selena. This might seem like an odd pick for those just reading it. Selena's personal lets her automatically crit on follow-up attacks if the main unit she's following up on crits with their first attack. So, guaranteed double crits? That sounds amazing, right? What's the catch? Well, while this skill doesn't have any built-in detriment, it's one of those cool in theory but useless in practice type skills. Think about it. How many enemies are going to survive a straight-up crit from a powerhouse like Camilla, especially when the crit bonus weaponry of Fates turns critical hits into 4x damage instead of 3x? I'm sure there are some weird situations that could exist, where you need both units to crit to get a kill, but the vast majority of enemies in Fates aren't strong enough to survive a crit from most of your units anyway. And those that can probably aren't taking much base damage from Selena's follow-up, meaning it will either not be enough to kill, or so much overkill that it will never be required. A cool concept for an ultimately useless skill. 3 houses. Goodie Basket. Raphael. Weak, inconsistent, and potentially disruptive to better strategies, Goodie Basket is considered by some to be Raphael's worst quality. It's a luck percent chance to heal 10% HP at the end of turn, which is a small bonus that no sane player would ever plan a strategy around. However, when several of the game's strongest class skills, such as Wrath, Vantage, or Defiance skills require an HP threshold to be passed under, a random chance to self-heal and bring yourself out of that threshold is not good. And sure, you don't have to use threshold skills on Raphael. He gets Battalion Wrath and can be built around a solid list of fist arts, but a passive skill that limits his potential has got to be considered one of the worst passives in this game, and pretty up there for the series. Doze Off Linhard. A similar skill that's basically just as useless is Linhard's Doze Off, a personal skill that restores 10% of his own HP whenever he uses the Wait command. On one hand, this skill is a lot easier to control, no random healing that you don't see coming first. On the other hand, 10% is still very little. For a character with very little HP to begin with, you'd be better off using a Vulnerary or an Elixir for self-healing if you're just gonna wait anyway. And realistically, you're never going to be using the Wait command enough between exposing Linhard to damage to make up enough HP that it will matter. Most of the time, he will either not be taking damage to begin with, or he'll be constantly taking action and being too busy to wait for several turns to self-heal. It's a funny skill for funny naps on the battlefield, but definitely isn't good enough to avoid this list. Engage. Seconds? Benet. For a game that desperately needs every bit of uniqueness to make units stand out, Benet's personal skill just isn't it. Seconds is a luck percent chance to not use up kitchen leftovers when Benet eats them. Leftovers are a single-use healing item that restores 20 HP and are made every time you cook in the Somniel and make a meal of C rank or higher, but are thrown out whenever you cook again, meaning you have at most one chance for this proc every map, and that's assuming you give leftovers to B'nai in the first place, and not another unit trying to make use of Celica's favorite food skill or just in need of a quick 20 HP self-heal. For a unit that already gets overlooked by many players, B'nai's personal skill isn't anywhere good enough to be worth fielding him for if you weren't already, and even if you do, at best you're getting a free use or two of what's essentially an already free concoction. Bane. Soth's Bond Ring. As a bit of a departure, I'll finish this list up by talking about a Bond Ring skill. To briefly summarize, Bond Rings are side options to the Emblem Rings that provide small stats, and for a few S-rank rings, skills. They are themed heavily around the character they came on, and in Soth's case, this is true, but in possibly the worst way ever. Bane is the Whisper class mastery skill in Radiant Dawn, and it makes a return and engage on Soth's Bond Ring. It's a half of dexterity chance to reduce your opponent's HP to 1 instead of dealing your normal attack damage, but it doesn't work against some bosses. Which sounds alright, I guess. So what's so bad about that? Sure, the proc chance is a little low, but it's a powerful effect, right? And Radiant Dawn was pretty solid. Bane would never proc if your regular attack damage would have killed. In Engage though, this isn't accounted for, and instead if the skill procs when you otherwise would kill, you won't. This then asks the question, who is this skill for? It's not for low dexterity units, who will rarely proc it, but it's bad for high dexterity units too, who might proc it twice in a row, or proc it on the second killing blow, and thus fail to kill. This happening just once is enough to never want to equip this skill again. Just RNG abuse for Ulwin's or Claude's Bond Ring, and toss this ring aside. At the end of the day, Bane is just a poorly designed skill, and for that bad design alone, it deserves to be on this list. And that will do it for today's list. Of course, that's just a few of the worst skills in the series. This series has a boatload of other ones to talk about. Unsurprisingly, more to be picked out from the very same games. I feel really bad for some of these characters' personal skills though. Boy, did they pick the short end of the stick here for some actively detrimental skills or ones completely meaningless in the player's hands when their allies have like damage buffs or rallies on command. And can they please stop making these luck % healing personals though? Anyways, that's it for today's video. If you've got some contenders for awful skills in the series that I didn't mention, comment down below and make sure you leave a like to help this video get recommended. I know it's been over like a month since my last upload, but I'm trying to get back into video production, and I do have some pretty exciting announcements that I'm going to keep my fingers crossed on. Thank you so much for watching this video. Have a good day. Deuces.